Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's session, Beyond Accents. Just a few housekeeping announcements from Native Earth Performing Arts. If you could make sure your cell phones are turned off, we'd appreciate that. Also, if you're sitting along the aisles, if you could keep your bags free of the aisleways and try to keep the aisleways unobstructed for fire safety purposes. And also, they've requested that you not have food or eat food inside the studio. So thank you in advance for that. And without further ado, I think I'll hand things over to our chair, Marjorie Chan.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It was a great morning here, so I know some of you are returning, some of you might be new. My name is Marjorie Chan. I'm chairing, I like that word, but chairing this panel. Very honored to be asked. We're going to have a conversation today in a slightly different format than this morning. So I'll get to that. Just because I feel like our panelists are unique. Not that the morning's panelists were not unique, but the discussions that come out of kind of their perspectives, I think not requires, but perhaps could embrace some conversation immediately following their statements and their positionings. The official brief on this panel, I'll read it. Beyond Accents focuses on the various languages of the theater, on translation, on acting with accents, on signing, and on supertitles in order to explore techniques by which linguistic differences, interpreted broadly, can be used as tools for the creation of new theatrical forms. That's a lot. I hope we get to all of that. We'll try. We have 2 hours. Oh, which reminds me. Sorry, I'm just going to start the timer so that I can track us. Great. Great. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. I know that you guys do have the bios inside your programs, but I'll just kind of do the first line of them. Immediately to my left is Cynthia Ashberger, who has worked as a theater director, writer, and actor and producer for the last 30 years. She teaches acting at Ryerson School of Performance. The question of language and identity is the main theme of her satirical tongue play. Next to her, so unfortunately, Catherine McKinnon is not able to join us due to a work conflict. She wasn't able to make it back into Toronto in time. Luckily, we've welcomed Samreen Aziz to the panel. Samreen is a community artist whose recent acting credits include Murder You for... Apparently, I'm already over time.
2 minutes. That's it.
I wanted to stopwatch. There we go. I know I go on and on. It's why I need it. Samreen's acting credits include Murder You for Cream Productions, as well as Peter Cockett's CAS9, Redesign a Human, a probing look into genetic manipulation and the ethical implications of preserving deaf culture. Next to her is Julia Lenardin, is that correct? She's a professional voice, speech, and dialect coach for film and TV and theater. Her credits include on Broadway, the voice coach for Matilda the Musical at the Schubert, off-Broadway, English clarification coach for Gad Elmaleh at the Carnegie Hall, as well as lots of TV and film and multiple institutions of learning. I'm trying to, instead of reading the whole thing. Next to her is Shelley Liebenbuck. She's a theater scholar and a dramaturge. She's currently conducting research on multilingual dramaturgy as a 2017 postdoctoral fellow funded by the Canadian Consortium of Performance and Politics in the Americas, and she holds a PhD from the University of Toronto. So please welcome our panelists. I'm here as the chair, but I also, I may insert myself in this conversation at times, and so by way of introduction, I wanted to locate myself so that you guys had a sense of why I was inserting myself. By way of introduction professionally, I was an actor, I turned a writer. I'm currently the artistic director of Cahoots Theatre, now celebrating its 30th season of Staging Diversity. Over the last few years, our particular company, we have been working quite a bit with deaf artists in various capacities. And this season, we launched the Deaf Artists and Theaters Toolkit, the DAT, which is online, which tracks some of the learnings that we had as an organization working with deaf artists, and hopefully can help others to be able to do that, or as a starting place from our experience. Further, just to locate me in this part of this conversation, I am the child of immigrants. My parents arrived from Hong Kong in the late 60s, and for both sides, I was the first of their families to move to North America. They've lived in Canada for 50 years now, all of their lives in Toronto or north of Toronto in Markham. They now live in Scarborough, which is also where I grew up. My first language was Cantonese, but that was quickly displaced in fluency by English. In my artistry, I am a playwright, and a lot of my text-based work deal with Chinese themes and Chinese history. As we move into the panel, I just want to, instead of offering kind of a positioning in terms of me, I want to offer some questions that have been consistent for me in my career, and kind of in reading some of our panelists' statements, as well as kind of around. So I wanted to offer these questions to put into the air, number one, and to maybe provoke questions of your own, should you have, as we encounter and engage with these panelists here. So here are just some questions that have come up. How should plays that are written in English but convey characters living in a different country or would naturally be speaking a language other than English handle the dialogue? What are theater schools doing to prepare students for a diverse marketplace? What role does titling, and I mean all those types of titling, whether it be surtitling or super titling or dynamic titling, as Trevor Schwellnus likes to say, what role does it have in an increasingly culturally diverse theater community? What about performers with natural accents? Where is there space in Canadian theatre for works that do not feature English or French at all? I'm sure these are not the only questions that are going to come out of this panel. I'm sure you collectively are brilliant and we'll have many more questions. So I hope that those come up as we do engage with the panelists, and we'll have time to do that. In respect to format, as I mentioned, just because what I would like to do is I would have each of the panelists give their position, and I'd like to open it up for questions, including from panelists to each other, as well as the audience, after each statement, so that we're kind of just dealing with one thing at a time, and maybe that's just my inability to deal with all the big ideas all at once, but just kind of address each one at each time. And so I'll be quite cognizant of, when we get to the end of a statement, that if there is a question from the audience, just be really clear with your hand, especially if you're in the back row, only because of the lights and things like that. Without further ado, I'd like to start with Cynthia Ashberger. I asked each of the panelists to respond to a prompt that was built out of the main goals of the symposium. And so, I can mention those, but it also feels like people are able to come up with their own positioning beyond that, but just as a thing. So here's Cynthia.
Okay. Can you hear me, or microphone? Yeah, okay. Hello, and it's really encouraging to see this number of people caring about this topic. I think that's wonderful. About, I think, 20 years ago, I wrote to the Equity newsletter after a reviewer said that after I acted in Not Spain by Richard Sanger. It was a very successful show and nominated for a Governor General's Award. I played a journalist from Montreal. And Arturo Fresolone played a thinly disguised Bosnian man. He's from Argentina. And a reviewer wrote, how could she, it was a wonderful show, but how could she played really well, but how could she play a journalist from Montreal? Just replace that with color of skin. And this was because of my accent. Because of the way I sounded, I couldn't play a journalist from Montreal in her mind. Similarly, at that time, 20 years ago, we took that show to London, Ontario, and another reviewer said, well, we have to address the elephant in the room. And that was that this woman with a thick Eastern European accent played a journalist from Montreal. Now, replace that with the color of skin and say, we have to address the elephant in the room that this black woman played an elephant from Montreal. And it was the elephant in the room. So, you know, it is very easily to get kicked when you are this kind of the third marginalized, you know. 1 out of 5 Canadians, that's 6 million people in this country, doesn't speak English or French at home. English or French. 1 out of 5 Canadians, 1 out of 2 or 3 Torontonians, depending on, I've seen different statistics. In Toronto, of course, that number is higher. That number is not represented upon our stages at all. So my question to you is, what are our shared values about the English language in the English theater, let's say in Toronto, and then more specifically about the casting in relation to pronunciation? So yesterday, because it was such a wonderful keynote, I changed everything, and I thought I'm going to share a couple of stories. There's a lot of my school colleagues here, Natalie and Jen Stephenson, and we all went to U of T. We did PhD there together. And Jonathan Miller, I don't know if you know who he is. He ran the Old Vic, and he did National Theatre. He was the associate director there. He directed a million things for the BBC. Really, really powerful, big guy, important guy. Came to talk to us about directing. And I remember this sentence very, very vividly. He said, it is vital, and that relates to your first question. It is vital for the 3 sisters to be from the same cultural background and to look the same. By that he meant, I think, the color of the skin. He said, it is vital for the 3 sisters. Chekhov wrote it so, that it is vital for the 3 sisters to look the same. And I remember just being really shaken by this question. This is about 15 years ago. Thinking, well, okay, that means that I will never, ever get to play. I played Irina back in Croatia, where I'm from, but I thought, everybody wants to play Masha. And somewhere deep in my heart, I thought, oh, maybe I'm still not too old to relate to the young man from yesterday, to play this part. And then I thought, no, this will never happen because I will never sound like the 2 other sisters. Maybe I'll be the same color as them, but I will never get cast as that. And of course, the question that I had then was, so am I really sentenced to playing only self-portraits for the rest of my life? And I think that the casting, very often, and we can talk about style, and we can talk about we can talk about different styles where maybe, we can get cast to play a dog, or we can cast to play anybody. But most generally, even in the diversity, the casting now has somehow sentenced us to mainly play self-portraits. And I have spent the last 22 years teaching acting at Ryerson, and I ran the program there for the last 14 years. And my main purpose in life is to teach young people and say to them, you can play anything, you can play anybody, you can take anybody's experience, you can be anybody. Because you're an actor, you're playing a part. You can be anybody. You just have to be a good actor. And so I'm really asking, do I have to even teach that? My little young roommate right now is a young black woman. She graduated from Ryerson last year, and last night I came from this, and so she said, how was your night? And I said, well, I was at this, and she's like, yeah, everybody's talking about that. And she says, well, I played in Tales from Vienna Woods, I played a 50-year-old white woman from Vienna, and I had a fantastic time. And I said, yes, you had a fantastic time, and you were wonderful playing a 50-year-old white woman from Vienna. So I'm just, again, asking, what is the repertoire, what is the language, and what is the style? What is vital to Canadian theater in this country where there's 6 million people who speak with an accent? Many of them who don't speak English and French at home speak with an accent. What is vital for our casting? So another story. At Ryerson, we very rarely have students who sound differently. We now have visible minority, but we don't have audible minority. Very often, people don't apply, and very often we place, I think, a much harsher eye in the audition. This person has to be super exceptional if we were to take them when they sound differently. And we had a super exceptional student who was actually a French Canadian. And when they graduate, we recommend them to the Birmingham Conservatory for the audition. And we were kind of thinking, like, who should we recommend? And I said, well, let's recommend her. She's fantastic. And people said, no, we can't recommend her. Stratford will never take her. Do you hear anybody on Stratford stage with an accent? She's French Canadian, people. She's not an Eastern European elephant in the room. So we did recommend her because that was where I think I lost it. Third story, very recently. We just took our students to to Los Angeles. We performed a show that I directed about our 4th year in February. And we took them to LATC, Los Angeles Theater Center, for an audition. They auditioned for a person who runs a Latin American theater company. And we again started talking about diversity. And what was vital to him was that people play, again, themselves. So that a person who is Mexican a character who is Mexican is played by a Mexican, a character who is white is played by white, a character who is paraplegic is played by a paraplegic person, and so on. So I am asking once again, can I play you? Can you play me? Just because I sound differently, people who speak English as a first language, they take on accents. Can I try to take your accent? Can I do that? Can I just most recently in Canada, can I play a black man in love? Or am I going to receive a death threat for that? Am I just destined to play a self-portrait now? Is that the new fashion? So the audible minority is that group of people who speak English with a discernible foreign accent. That is the audible minority, and I feel that the audible minority is really outside of the conversation. And I'll just finish. Am I done?
No, you're good.
Okay. I just want to read a quote by Patsy Rodenberg. She's one of the foremost authorities on the English voice and speech theater training, and in her book, she defines accented speech as, I quote, a complex and highly charged subject. Rothenberg has, quote, received too many letters of complaint not to know there is prejudice against accented speech among audiences. She attributes this to the fact that, quote, accents carry the weight of such political fear that even when an actor is perfectly audible in an accent, she receives letters of complaint that the performer is unclear, unquote. So when it comes to speaking English, everyone is equal, but some people are just more equal than others, and we had that in communism. Everyone is equal, but some. Anyway, so I shouldn't say accent. It really is non-standard speech. I was communicating with a person from Moisey who specializes in this, and she kept correcting me. You can't say accents. It's non-standard speech. And so I'm just posing to you a concept that is already accepted in sociolinguistics, which is, and I know this will hurt those who have English as their mother tongue, but English is lingua franca, and we all use it all around the world. So I'm sorry that there is no such thing as mother tongue in English anymore. There is no such thing as mother tongue. Okay, I know it hurts, and I know it's your political right that's being now oppressed. So I would like to just raise an awareness that when it comes to standard pronunciation in English, that this is, in Canadian context, an abstract phenomenon. It really is. Okay, and can we? I know it's very difficult because my daughter doesn't have the same problem as I have. She speaks English, it's her mother tongue. And I have to say to her, but you know what? It's not your mother tongue. Because I'm her mother. But would I get cast as her mother? I might not. I might not. If she were to play Ophelia, would I be her mother? I might not. Because why? They're Italian? So those are my stories. So the current theatrical conservative convention is very much there to support the status quo of the standard English pronunciation and sound. However, contemporary English language is more complex than what the Canadian stages offer. So we should be able to enter into a discourse about the multiplicity of English pronunciation and the far-reaching social implications of it. What are the factors needed to overcome the concept of mother tongue and borrowed tongue in the post-colonial theater in Canada? Is this even possible? Do we care? Do we want to do this? And finally, I do love my accent.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic. Is there anyone on the panel that wants to respond to some of Cynthia's statement, or anyone out in the house? Everyone's quiet now. We're just going to grab the mic. Yep. We are just recording, so we want everyone to speak on mic.
Thanks.
And could you introduce yourself when
dear,
you
do I have to?
Just you say your name, because
Hi, I'm Sadhna. It's I have to say it is difficult to hear you speak, Cynthia, about this issue, because I really just don't feel that theater schools on a whole are doing anything to let in more people of color or people with accents. So I don't know, can you speak to some of the things that Ryerson is working on in order to address this issue?
I see 450 to 500 applicants every year. In terms of the visible minority, absolutely. In terms of the percentage of people auditioning, I would say there is one visible minority person to every 10 white people, or maybe even less, like 15 to 1. So I spoke to Phil Aiken about this, because he went to Ryerson as well, and I don't know how you can recruit people. We are really trying. I would say for every visible minority applicant, we really, really give special consideration to that person and want them to be admitted into the program. So we are really trying. We are not getting the same percentage. In terms of the audible minority, it's much, 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 much less. I would say out of the 450, we'd get 2. And then, you know, we need to kind of look at some kind of standard what we're looking for, which is their image, are people connected, how are they physically connected, vocally, I mean, all the things that we're looking at.
Can I just offer a provocation that, including this morning, is there some obsession with canonical works of inserting people of color in canonical works that does speak to some of the basis of a lot of our training in this country? That maybe those stories from that canon may not be of interest to diverse cultures. I just question. I ask that as a question as someone who had a classical training. Theater, but that I quite embraced, but I offer it as a question.
Well, you know, it's it's sometimes very, very practical, which is Shakespeare has a lot of parts. Girls can play men, you know, and
So does Chow Yu from China.
yeah. Okay. So maybe we don't know about that or don't have it. But like, you know, we certainly are. I would say we certainly are very much still Eurocentric. You know, in terms of the repertoire for sure. But then the question is, you know, what are you preparing the students for? And
For sure, and for sure, we're you know the dominant performance form still is a Eurocentric form.
So partly is that, and then and then again, the further question is the casting, which is really interesting, and that is that still most casting, and I'm not saying that anyone should cast. I'm not saying that I know how people should cast, and I would never legislate casting. But I'm just saying, perhaps we could take a look at the casting, and we could say, well, if we want, because I had a conversation with you, and you said I want my shows to look at the to look like a subway car, and I'm saying, well, can they sound like a subway car too? Or is that completely impossible? Is that because maybe 30 or 40 years ago when we said, well, we're going to have a black Hamlet, everybody would say, oh my God, black Hamlet, horrifying. And now it's, you know, now it's fine. So can we now say maybe we can have an accented Hamlet? Oh my God, horrifying, horrifying. Or an accented Ophelia. Oh my God, horrifying. You know, maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe we can't. I'm not sure. I'm just again saying, what are expectations of the English language in Canada, in the society that we're in? I'm from Croatia. I'm telling you, they're not going to cast anyone with an accent there. I'm sure, because at the same time they don't have one out of 5 people who sound differently, you know. So, and there are a couple of actors actually in Zagreb. One is an Iranian actor who showed up, and there's a Hungarian accent as well, who, you know, person who came and somehow integrated in that society, and it's a much smaller, I would say, scene.
Thank you. I think there was another question up in the corner. I can't quite see who that is.
Hi, I'm Claire. I was just wondering if there's any representatives from the theater schools here today, other than Ryerson? Yeah? Oh, cool. Okay, great. Awesome. Yay. Anyone from George Brown? Yay. Oh, hi, Deb. Hi. Yeah, I guess I agree, and with what you're saying about received pronunciation, probably not being like a layover from colonialism. But I was also wondering, when you say that you're trying to get, you know, when you see there's the low amounts of people with accents who are applying to the schools, I guess it just makes me ask, is it, obviously you have an accent, but is it staffed with people, you know, are the teachers, like, is there representatives on
there
that?
were a couple of teachers. There was Rafał Sokolovsky and myself. And now there's a person from Ukraine, Pavlo Bossi, who is teaching set design. So there are three of us. I mean, yes, there are some professors. But for me, it was really telling that our one Spanish-speaking person, she's from Argentina, after 2 years, and she was doing fine, but after 2 years, she quit. And she said, I just looked outside, and I just don't think I have a chance. So she quit because she didn't think that that she even had a chance remotely to make a living. Yeah. So I mean, it is. We are marginalized. You know, we are very marginalized. Arturo Fresalone, with whom I acted, I think he quit. Draga Navaragic, who was one of the people who was here, she went back to Belgrade. Costa went back to Romania, didn't he? Yeah. Costa went back to Romania. I mean, after a while, it just gets so discouraging, and most people just quit.
There's a response here. Yep.
Sorry, for the purposes of time,
Yeah.
perhaps we can move on to Shimreen.
Okay.
If you could hold your questions, we will have a question
Oh, yeah,
answer
yeah. Sure,
period
sure.
at the end, but we just want to make sure we have enough time for all of the panelists. I know, but we can
Can
come
we
back
save
to
it
questions
to
at
the end?
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Maybe one more quick question, but we should really have to move on to make
Great.
sure we get all of the panelists in.
Hi, my name is Diana, and in 2015, I published in Theatre Research in Canada what I still think to be, because I didn't find another one, the first academic paper about immigrant accents on professional stages. And the part of my paper was about Cynthia's work herself, and she gave me a short research interview over email. And I will skip a very nice story because I was just one, but there is no time. But although I fully stand by Cynthia's position, I'm going to challenge you right now. Like, well, in my article, I cite your reaction to playing a Canadian character in a Judy Thompson's play, if you remember. And that was a kind of Stockholm syndrome. She became more Catholic than the Pope. And she asked, yes. And she asked Judy Thompson to give a multicultural, a foreign background to her character to justify her accent. So I think this is a very telling story about, you know, feeling incarcerated or feeling trapped. Now, I will just say that I don't agree that English cannot be a mother tongue. I think, and I have on the website of Canadian Parliament a poem which is called Deflowering English. And I chose as an illustration the many types of English you can access in Word. Each of them can be a mother tongue. To me, my problem is what you say, that you might not be cast to play the the mother of your own daughter because you have different accent. My point is, I think we just need to change our concept of what is very similar. Like academics and the arts and theater artists, we have to catch up with life. We caught up with life in terms of visible, I hate this expression, in terms of what we see, and we have the concept, which sounds bad, but colorblind. I think we just have to catch up with the subway train on our stages. That's all I had to say.
Thank you so much.
I do want to just briefly respond. I did write on my sheet that I was holding in my hand, mention the Stockholm Syndrome. It just slipped. So thank you. Yeah, I have developed this the Stockholm Syndrome because I am an actor, and like you just think, well, okay, which part will I get? So I'm looking always. Oh yeah, do they have an accent? Are they from somewhere else? And that maybe I have a chance. And so I mean, but that is always playing a self portrait. And then Judith cast me in Who Killed Snow White, and so my mother had a Canadian accent, and I said to Judith, please explain somehow my my mother and me, because no, I don't think people will believe it. So that is Stockholm syndrome. That is definitely, and she said, what? She said, but that's Judith, and Judith is unique, I think, this way. She said, okay, I will, no problem, if that makes you feel good. I will, and so she added that, I lived in Europe because they were divorced, and I grew up in Europe, and then reconnected with my mother. But I have developed this. I don't see myself playing anymore the parts that I think I can play, that maybe maybe from before Jonathan Miller. Anyway, enough about me. Let's move on.
Thank you. We'll move on to Samreen. And so Samreen, I kind of propagated kind of a question of like, what creative opportunities might be presented if creative artists took advantage of diverse cultural forms and processes that are a part of Canada, and how can that result in perhaps new forms or new ways of theatrical thinking?
I think I'll backtrack a little bit before I answer that. And I'm just curious first with the audience, how many of you actually know sign language? Raise your hands just so I can get an idea. Actually know and can use sign language. Okay, wonderful. Then one or two, it's better than nothing. When we think about mainstream hearing theater companies and deaf theater companies, obviously in deaf theater companies we use our language, sign language. And the most recent production I was involved in was CSA 9 with Peter Crocker, who's here. And thank you so very much for being here. So that production was pretty amazing. Actually, I'll go back to my point for a second. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up attending a school for the deaf, and we use sign language. And so I was with my peers. We were using a visual language. We're using the same language. So I had access to my language every day. I graduated, and then I got involved in theater. And I cannot tell you the number of barriers I faced and things that I observed in that. And the number of hearing people in the theater world who don't understand a thing about deaf people's history, our culture. Often the vibe in the room when you entered would not be welcoming. There was people feeling a little perplexed about how to approach and work with us. So for deaf people involved in theater, deaf professionals, we've had our own barriers and experiences with that. And there's not many productions as well that involve sign language or want to recognize deaf performers on stage or as part of an actual story. There's just not that recognition of our language and our culture. There's many reasons for that historically. There's not enough exposure. The use of our language has been prevented. When we talk about hearing theater, a lot of things are auditorily based. Sometimes you'll have something that's very harmful to the deaf community is having a hearing actor chosen for a deaf role when you have a number of very adept deaf performers. And we've had to fight for our rights and fight for roles that have been stolen by hearing performers or by people in theater who choose to give those roles to our hearing compadres. So that's a huge concern that's alive and well in our community. And a lot of it is about, a theater wanting a production to take off. They want to, make a good gross in terms of the numbers of tickets sold to recoup the expenses put into a production. And then it becomes sort of an appropriation of our language and culture at that point. And that's a very serious concern. It actually is, it's quite devastating for our community at large. And so, Catherine McKinnon, who wasn't able to be here today, has had a really important role in TIDFAF, Toronto International Deaf and Arts Community Festival that happens. And she's brought a lot of large awareness to deaf community and the deaf artistic community. And the goal is to improve sort of exposure to theater in general, and also the advent now of using what we refer to as having deaf interpreters who work in tandem with hearing interpreters for theater production and on stage, etc. So we're still working. Exposure has a long way to go, let me tell you. So that aside, I want to talk about the production. Peter's been mentioned, so I'd like to share my experience with this. As I mentioned, I grew up as a fluent signer. And this production was very different because there was a number of us in the cast. There was an integration of deaf and hearing people. And it was an incredible experience, I have to tell you. It was beautiful. So not only from the cast to the crew, to the director, to sound, design, all of that worked together. We had interpreters on set, absolutely. And I want you to change the perception of bringing an interpreter on board. It's not just for me. It's for the people who do not use sign language on the set. So the interpreters are for everyone present who do not share two languages. That's a way we need to think about it. That was phenomenal. That was present the entire way through our production. Peter was open to suggestions. I mean, so he's bringing forward his experiences and his culture. So he's hearing, I'm deaf. We sort of, you come to what could be an impasse, but what it meant for both of us that we need to have an open mind and work together and bridge that, share what we have. And I think then is when you can talk about diverse theater. When we're looking at the script, when we're looking at the deaf characters as well, I just was so thankful that the amount of respect that went both ways and the details involved in terms of the discussions we had. So I think if after you look back on a production, if all you've had are negative experiences, I don't know that you could say that that production was so successful. But I think if you can cross those hurdles and work together and share what you have, you can end up with a production that is impassioned and also working together between cultures. I have to tell you, hands off to Peter. He's from England. I can't tell you what, just his work ethic in terms of his role as a director, his open-mindedness, his flexibility working with us. There was never a moment where he was judgmental. Instead, he would come forward with sort of his own experiences, and we would share that and talk about it and then figure out a way to approach it. And I just lost my train of thought. 1 minute, right. In our working together, it was ongoing. The end result, I can't even tell you how amazing it was. It was just, I don't quite know how to describe it. When we take language, for example, I feel like this is an example of how we can work together. Peter, to me, is emblematic of how, as a director, he could work with somebody who's deaf on the cast. And I would actually call him, because of his ways, because of his mindfulness, he is an ally to us. He approached this project, he approached this production, keeping in mind that open-mindedness and not, the quality is what he was doing, and not looking at it as disability. He was welcoming, and if something became sort of a barrier or a hindrance, it wasn't about being deaf or not being able to do something. It was a challenge to the theater production itself. And I feel like when other theaters can catch on to this and impart this in their productions, then we will have theater that's open, accessible, and diverse. But if people want to repeat the same thing that has happened since time began, then we're going to have the same kinds of theater happening. I think you can't do this, and you can't be open-minded and want that diversity if you're not really and truly embodying that. And I really, really want to impart again the history that we still have to this day of deaf, skilled performers having roles taken from them by hearing actors who think they can go in and represent a deaf person. Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. is a deaf university, and I was involved in a production called Murder You. That was in 2001. So, obviously it's a mystery, and it actually went on to become a TV program. But I have to tell you, sadly enough, the crew and the director on that production were hearing. So people got cast in their roles. And when we're talking about Gallaudet University, for those of you who don't know, it's almost like a deaf mecca in the world, if you will. There's deaf people everywhere, but still they chose to cast hearing people. Even the film crew didn't even know how to capture the space you need to use to capture a signing actor on screen properly. So they'd come on set, they'd get their little snippet of 2 hours of like ASL 101, and then go and think they can perform. So we were, I can't even tell you what this does to deaf professional actors. The opportunity that was lost and the fact that you're wanting to choose a hearing person over a culturally deaf person who has that linguistic knowledge, experiential knowledge. So, yeah, so there we went. Anyway, again, budgetary reasons, on with the show. Let's keep moving, let's keep going. And you've got hearing people who, pardon me, could barely sign their way out of a paper bag. They couldn't, and that's sort of what they went with. And the interpreter's just letting me know the piece you were laughing at. So, I mean, it was just, don't get me wrong, the hearing folks, they were very kind, but you're bringing in people who have no concept of what it means to be a deaf person. They don't have that lived experience. So 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks would go by, and then, so there was a bit of excitement mixed with, it was kind of bittersweet. Was this program actually representing our deaf community? Was it representing us culturally, historically? And when you watch it, deaf people knew right away that this is sort of, it's an appropriation. I don't know what more you can call it. You see the person on stage as a deaf person or on that screen, you know that they're a hearing person who learned a little bit of sign language in a 2-hour time slot. And again, that role was taken from us, the opportunity for a deaf person who should be in that role. And it was taken from us. So my message would also be, let deaf performers perform in the deaf characters. And Julianne Moore, actually, most of you know, she's the famous redheaded actress in Hollywood. I mean, she's won awards and things like that, but she just had a role recently in a film as a deaf person, and the deaf community was in an uproar about it. So again, why are you not hiring deaf actors? Why do you not want deaf? These roles are meant for deaf performers. They're not meant for hearing performers to take on. And I would say that's definitely an example of, in our deaf community, what we refer to as hearing privilege, and that's something we're having to confront on an ongoing basis to this day. So what it does is it really beats down your morale as a deaf performer, because you're a performer first, but you're bringing to the table those cultural pieces, those linguistic pieces. So my goal is that with the Deaf Artists and Theaters Toolkit, that knowledge can be passed along and create an awareness. The Deaf Culture Center in Toronto is another piece of it that showcases deaf artists, deaf performers, deaf authors, etc. So we've got a long way to go. We have a long way to go. And I cannot tell you how precious my language is to me. American Sign Language. It's hearing people sort of look at our language sometimes that they minimize it and they think it's cute or it's beautiful or it's this or that. It's a real language. It's very precious to me, and we've experienced enough sort of cultural and linguistic appropriation to last a lifetime. And it's the same thing when we talk about audible minorities, if you will. You need to respect and honor those people's experiences. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Samreen. Are there questions from the audience? No? Oh, yes. There is a third. Can we just switch out? Yeah. Thank you.
Hi there, my name's Liza. I'm also from Cahoots. I'm curious, Samreen, how you would respond to Cynthia's comments about self-portrait, because what you're talking about is a lot about being able to play your own culture, being able to represent your culture on stage, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about being able to play more broadly, and about that concept of self-portraiture and how you feel about that.
I'm not sure how I feel about that. When we look at culture, you can look at someone's heart, where they've grown up, their history, their family values and traditions. And I want someone who's has that same heart playing the role of that character, because that heart is so important. I can't speak to accents, obviously, but I'm thinking about mindset and knowing that portrayal is going to be honest in whatever facet you're talking about, and that they're going to be authentic to that. And so I want someone in the role who's going to authentically understand and play that. So I'm not sure how that works. And I think, as a deaf person, I know my struggles and my issues, and then I'm not actually going to know a hearing character's struggles per se. I won't know, how to play that necessarily, and it won't match up. So I think, I can work in places that are authentic to me, and I can find a good connection with the character.
Can I just offer, just to be provocative a little bit, but Samreen, that also means that, like, for me, like, for example, I am currently casting a social worker. Couldn't, in a contemporary setting, would it mean that I would only have to think about if the intent of the playwright was a hearing social worker, that would it mean that I could not consider a deaf actor to play this social worker? But just to offer that the broader kind of, just a slightly opposite perspective too, that
Yeah, I
that-
think you can. Yeah.
yeah, that there's
I
a broader
think,
sense to that.
Just in terms of a deaf actor needing to speak, that's where you'd have to draw the line. But, yeah.
But then I was thinking,
And I guess there are deaf people who can use their voice, and I think it would depend on a personal preference. But if the character is a
Is a deaf social
deaf
worker.
social worker, how the character is written, yeah.
I was just, thank you for that question, because I was just thinking about that. And also there maybe could be a possibility, we can go that wild, that you play a speaking person and with subtitles. Or, can we play each other? Can we play each other? I mean, if we are actors, and that was, I forgot to really summarize my point, which was we are actors, we're trained to play parts. And yes, we will be cast according to type. So you will be cast according to your type, I will be cast according to my type, 90% of the time. And we will try to find then authenticity within that type. I mean, that's what we're going to do. But maybe there is also a kind of style of theater or style of performance where we are actors that can play outside of our type.
Thank you. Any other questions? Can't quite see. Great. Thank you. It's probably on.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Hi, Samreen. I'm Peter Cockett. I directed the Cast 9 show, and I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, for Samreen for being so kind about the process and for her work on the show. It was an amazing experience working with her and with Kat McKinnon. I just want to pick up on the idea of this beyond accents, because that, for me, was the exciting part of that show, that it wasn't just figuring out the accent, is that in that space between my knowledge and Samreen and Kat's knowledge of deaf culture was really exciting creative territory, right? The fact that I couldn't understand where they were coming from initially, and I needed to explain where I was coming from, and the debates we had about that space in between was where the best work in the show emerged. And I think we only just got to the surface of it. There's a whole other level. I mean, there's a whole other realm of theatrical possibility around the connection between sign language and gestural performance, which we didn't really manage to dig into, because learning how to work with hearing actors and deaf actors responding in a choreographed piece where we're used to timing movement with sound, and all of a sudden we think, well, only half the people on the stage can hear the sounds to respond to on this particular beat of the music. How do you do that? We didn't have enough time to really get to grips with that, and there was so much potential in that, which I think is exciting. And I just wanted to add that perspective that this is an opportunity that opens up possibilities for the stage. And that's something that I really enjoyed, that I learned from Samreen and Kat.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think that was articulated this morning on the panel about what's it? I don't know the exact name. Directing across difference. That difference actually offered opportunity for innovation, and I thought that was an interesting point that came out of from this morning, and a creative innovation that it forces, but it means that you need to engage in a different way, and that changes up the way your theater practice looks or sounds, frankly. Thank you so much. We'll move on to Julia. Switching gears, I offered some provocation to Julia, but I think she has lots to say on her own. Yeah, we're just going to get you your microphone. Just give us 2 seconds. So there's one here. I'm going to hand you this one. Yeah, you would like a stand. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Just 2 seconds. I don't think it's on.
There it is.
Perfect.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. My work as a voice, speech, and accent coach is both as a teacher and in the profession. But what I'd like to share with you today is more of my experience in the profession rather than teaching. If we go later on into more of a discussion with regards to conservatory training, we can speak of that. But I do want to stay within the realm of my recent coaching in the profession. I've just come back to Canada about a month ago. I've been in the United States for the last 4 years. So again, what I'd like to share with you may not be directly related to the Canadian experience as it is at the moment, but I think that the challenges of accent in all its dimensions are not just regulated here. They are elsewhere. So I think what I may have to say could be universal, or at least we can share. The context, actually, that I was asked about was really with regards to identity politics, diversity, and inclusion. So that'll be a bit of the theme. I think the basic work for me, or at least the work that I've given myself, is the responsibility to empower an actor through accent work. Whether it is accent acquisition, meaning, in my world, acquiring an accent other than your own. Polish accented English, Romanian accented English, various British accented Englishes. And another dimension of my work is what some of us call not accent reduction, but English clarification. Again, those two things are very different things. When actors come to me, professional actors come to me, and they ask, my agent says get rid of your accent, get rid of this. Well, I think if you try and get rid of anything, that's impossible, and it's disempowering. You can't. It's taking away who you are. And the actors who I've worked with, who have worked in that dimension, have never succeeded, because you can't get rid of something of yourself. Why should you? Terminology and words are important, but the only term that I'm using at the moment which works, and if there's another term that's better, please tell me, but clarification of standard when I work on it is not a universal, is not one pill, one pill will fix the situation. When I work with an actor who wishes and chooses to clarify their English and not necessarily speak as an American or a Canadian, there are aspects depending on how they speak English, their facility with the language more than anything else, and the grammar and the idiom that we will study and will craft something that is appropriate uniquely to them, that will empower them instead of reducing them. And for me, that's extremely important. I can't deal with the pressure that an agent puts on an actor. I can't deal with the casting system in the theater or particularly in film. I'm not part of that world. I don't make those decisions. I work in the trenches, and I work with to empower people who need that, yeah? But also, there's the positive side to accents too. I mean, it's acting, like you were saying. And I started as an actor too. Often accents can open up new realms of expression that we didn't have before. So we're not covering something up, we're actually digging more deeply into other corners of ourselves that we haven't explored yet. I often use the image of, as an actor, when I was an actor, I always found that the shoes that I wore in rehearsal were really important because they gave me a non-judgmental, subtle hint sometimes of the a different way of moving, balance, speaking, thinking from the ground up, from the floor, through the bones of my legs, up my spine, and out my mouth. Well, I've always tried to approach accents as shoes for the mouth, right? The muscles shift slightly. What information can we have that is as subtle as sort of, sometimes you can't even explain what the creative impulses are that come from that. And they go from our mouth, down the spine, into the floor. Right? So for me, accents, language work have two dimensions, a very positive creative side, and one that can be certainly restrictive. With regards to the work, I've been in New York for the last 4 years. I've been privileged to work on a voice team on a Broadway show, Matilda the Musical. We were the first and only voice team in the history of Broadway, and it was a great privilege to have that opportunity. With regards to dialects, though, and specifically identity politics, right, keep on that theme, the show is a British story and reflects such sensibilities. Therefore, the Royal Shakespeare Company, who was the originator and producer of the show, was insistent that their Broadway production maintain its British sensibility, that the story stay British, unlike the film that was made several years ago, and hence, the American actors that had to be cast because of equity rules adopt the various British accents, not change it into an American situation, American characters, and an American sound. I think that's important. Now, okay, so maybe the British culture is not maybe a marginalized culture, okay? Fair enough, okay? It is one of the standards, okay? Nonetheless, in this situation, they were still in a much larger context, in a world context. They were still jockeying to keep their political identity in this show and not have it reduced or changed to an American sensibility for American marketing, right? Now, there was one exception. Of course, there always are exceptions. And those were the Little Matildas. They did eventually have to slightly tweak their accents into what our accent coach, Ben, affectionately called slightly British or nearly British. The reason being is that the little Matties had, and they were only 8 years old, they had long passages, long monologues of complicated, colorful storytelling. And it was hard for the American ear to follow it. So the American producers were concerned and needed and insisted that that be shifted. Not changed completely, but tweaked. So it was a nearly British and quite unique to that particular production on Broadway. The second story that I would like to share with you is more of an example of accent inclusion and diversity for a non-standard actor, a non-standard English speaker. In New York, I had, and I still do actually, have the privilege of working with a remarkable stand-up comedian, Gad Elmaleh, who is of Moroccan.
Could I get you to just repeat and spell the name for the interpreters?
Of course,
I'm so sorry
certainly.
to interrupt.
No, that's so funny. I'm going to have to tell him this because he has the same problem. No one can say his name except for me. Okay. Gad, G-A-D, Elmaleh, E-L-E-M-E-H. Did I get that right? E-L-M-A-L-E-H. There we go. Elmaleh. He's actually very well known internationally, although not well known here in North America. He did his undergrad in Montreal, but then his career in comedy exploded when he went to Paris. And he was one of the first to bring some elements of American stand-up comedy to Europe. And he melded other European facets of comedy into his own. And so it's quite a unique blend of comedy that he brings with him. He came to New York just about 2 years ago to bring his French work to the United States in English for the first time. So when I first met him, he said to me, I don't want to sound like an American. What I would like from you is simply pronunciation clarification. And I said, okay, I can help you with that. That's fine. Yet, over the course of monitoring his show, he had a residency at the Public Theater at Joe's Pub for about 6 months. It was very clear to me very quickly that it wasn't so much pronunciation as it was a matter of clarity of intonation and rhythm, but particularly the rhythms of the rhetoric patterns of comedy in English. And that's really what was missing, more so than the stray reversed syllable word. He struggled tremendously to recognize, to hear, and to integrate our pitch patterns in English. Because in French, in essence, most of the words have the same weight. So the way they use melody and notes and the subtext of that is very different than in English. And in French, if you begin to use pitch, bubble, not good, very negative. So to use pitch is extremely threatening and emotionally hard. So he struggled with this, but he's a professional, he just kept going. We did have one moment, though, where it finally clicked. And we were at my kitchen table, we were working on new material, and he said, Julia, this one joke just doesn't work, and I don't know what to do about it. And I said, okay, look, again, Gad, it has to do with your punchline, and this particular word, you have to literally lift it much higher in pitch, so that we as English speakers understand that raise of pitch as contrast with regards to the rest of the joke. And that contrast that we hear, we find funny. If you drop the note, it's not going to be funny to us. We won't hear the contrast, we won't hear the humor. I said, look, Gad, I'm going to put it on the line. If you, even though this doesn't feel comfortable to you, if you just try it tonight, do it technically, purely technically. I know your heart won't be in it, just technically. If it doesn't work, if you don't get the laugh that you want, then I quit. You can fire me. I have to stand by what I do. And he went, okay. Okay. So he did it, he landed it, and it worked. So I'm still working with him, which is awfully nice. But I had to put myself in a position where it was either stay or go, believe me or don't, but do it. And he did. Now, did he feel sacrificed in any way of his culture, of his language? I asked him that. And he goes, no, not at all. It worked. Ça marche. And he was exploring, he was very curious to explore who he was in this new rhythm. Yeah? So Gad, hang on a second. So Gad's style of humor is actually observational humor. And he actually works to explore the difference between and the value of his Moroccan culture and language, the French language, and the American language. And within his set, he talks a lot about his difficulty with the language and his pronunciation and the accent and the intonation, and it's actually part of his work and the set and his writing. But stand-up is actually a very American cultural marker. And I witnessed quite a few American comedians quite critical of his work because his work and his sound wasn't like theirs. And they wanted him to be like them in style and in voice, quite publicly sometimes. But he is staying true to his voice and his vision. And what I admire about him is that the very aim of his work is to actively encourage the celebration of the diversity of each of the cultures that he's part of, Moroccan, French, and now American. You know, after much practice, he did his first successful tour of Canada and the United States last year that ended at Carnegie Hall this February. And it was so exciting to be there. And it was so rewarding that he was clear. He was landed every joke in the traditional English comedic rhetoric patterns, but as him, as who he is, and all the various cultures that affect him and influence him. So in conclusion, as a voice coach, again, I really think that through sound and speech rhythm, I hope to empower the people I work with, not reduce who they are. I can't really change the elephant in the room or a rather large mountain, but maybe I can change it a little bit, one person at a time, one job at a time, one coaching at a time. So accents and clarification, I think, can be empowering, not restrictive. And I think they can reflect and celebrate our diverse voices and beyond. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's so interesting what you said about the form, about Gad's form, that his aesthetic, although it was stand-up, that some Americans were not recognizing it as such because his own aesthetic was informed by his own rhythms and his own culture. And I think that that is something culturally diverse artists do experience, certainly in this country, that whatever they put on stage might be of a particular aesthetic that's informed by culture, and then changes the aesthetic, changes the form of the theater, and it doesn't necessarily conform to what has been on stage before and for many years. So I thought it was quite interesting. Are there any questions for Julia? I'm looking. No. I kind of have a question. Sorry, was there? Oh, yes.
Hi, Julia. Thank you so much for everything you said. And it meant a lot to me that you challenged the idea of accent reduction and you replaced it with English clarification. Now, if you could help me, I have a question. When I did my research 3 years ago, I read by linguists the statement that you cannot get rid of your accent because of various, like your accent in a second language, because of various physical issues. And then I was told by many actors that this is a lie, because if actors can learn an accent, then you can change your mother tongue accent. So just please tell me what's the truth from your experience. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I don't believe there is one particular truth. Again, with every actor, there's going to be a different circumstances that will inform. I can be specific, though, with my experience. I had the opportunity. Okay, first of all, there's a difference between acquiring an accent for a job and acquiring an accent for every day for the rest of your life. Now, the facility with an accent, really, one should be able to, chat in an accent that you're working on so that you can apply it to your work with much more ease. Yes? Nonetheless, often the two are separated, and actors will often just want to learn the accent on their lines. I don't encourage that, but nonetheless, that will happen. But for someone who is not an actor, who wants to change their accent from one to, let's say, standard, well, that's a different mindset. It's not an artistic one. It's much more personal, much more emotional. But nonetheless, I want to give you an example. At the moment, I live in Montreal, so I have the privilege and the joy to work with quite a few francophone and allophone clients, particularly for the francophone actors who come to me and want to speak with a standard accent. Well, they come to me and they want to. And the first thing I always find out is, do they want to, or are they being told to come to somebody to change it? So once I know what one is the other, then I can choose the way to work, right? But if they are there from their own volition, then psychologically and emotionally, it's a much better place to start, okay? So we start the work and so forth. But it's interesting that quite a few of them don't manage to keep up with the work. And it's not often because of the pressure of the Anglophone world on them to change their speech. It's actually the reverse. It's the pressure from the Francophone culture saying, you must not sound like an Anglophone. You are betraying our tribe. And I've had many an actor weeping in my home office because they can't get past that barrier. So there you go. Now, another story, though, with regards to the profession, I had the privilege to work with a young Francophone actor in a show several years ago in a production that both Rideau Vert and Siegel Center were co-producing. And the same actors were playing it in French as well as English in both theaters. Both actors were Francophone, switching into Anglophone. So the older actor had to play a German accent, that was fine. But the younger one was a Francophone who hardly spoke English and had to be a young man from California. Now the director chose to keep him as a Californian and not change him to a French person. So that was the director's choice, not my choice. I follow orders. That was my contract. We worked for a year and a half, and had to get through his psychological barriers. But the only thing that got him through was the fact he had signed a contract and his butt was going to be out there and he was going to have to do it. And that was a very good, way to keep him on course. By opening night, in my opinion, he was 90% there. 90%. The rest of, Montreal, right, it was fantastic. But it was a tremendous amount of work. So yes, it is possible. But it takes an amount of work that not that many people are willing to commit to. But it is possible. I think, though, first and foremost, one has to understand, one has to have a facility for the language first. Language and accent are two very different things. One has to have in any language. If I was going to go to Germany and work as a German speaker, with any accent from Germany, I would have to have a fluidity and a fluency in the language, first and foremost, no matter the accent of Germany. So do you see the difference? Yeah? So that's another challenge that I have to confront with some of my clients, that, the language has to be worked on first, and then the accent can be addressed. Have I answered your question?
I would like to comment on this.
I love my accent.
Well, you know what? I think it. Well, let me just say it has been possible for some people that I've worked with. Is it possible for everyone? I can't speak for anyone. I can only speak for the people that I've worked with. Is it possible for you to change your accent? Well, if you want to put the work into it, then there is the possibility. If you don't want to, and because of many decisions, then I guess the other question is it necessary? But then that's a whole other kettle of fish.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's a really, as we're talking, and how sensitive voice, language is culture. The way you sound is culture, and it's so personal. So I appreciate your quite sensitive approach to that. It's. I would say it's still. I would say there's still a challenge too of like how that as you approach with another artist. I'm sorry, Cynthia, we will. I just want to make sure we do have enough time for Shelley. And then if there's later questions, we'll come back. But here's Shelley.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. It's been great to get to listen and indeed to see. I think that we all have quite similar but different positionalities around this issue. So I definitely feel like I'll be speaking from a bit of a different perspective that'll hopefully echoes and offers provocations to some of the things. But it's an honor to be here and to be part of this panel. So I guess I should start by just kind of situating myself. So I am currently working as a dramaturg and a theater scholar. My area of interest is multilingual dramaturgy, and by multilingual I mean also multiple fluencies. So I'm not solely speaking of various verbal languages on stage, but also the question of paraverbal and nonverbal gesture. Specifically, I work in contexts that are intercultural, cross-cultural, and intracultural, to kind of take a page from Donna Michelle, who said yesterday, right? What does it mean to work in a diverse space? So that's already a very particular way that I'm working. And to give you a context of myself, so I grew up speaking 3 languages. My first language is Hebrew, then Spanish, then English. My dominant language is English. I also speak some French and German now, so I'm a plurilingual. And so my interest to the question of multiple fluencies on the stage, and specifically how we make those choices in rehearsal, and not just in rehearsal, but then also for the final production, what shows up in the aesthetics, in the final piece, are of course also for me, very individually motivated by the fact that my lived experience is already being someone who is constantly code switching, culture switching. My accent didn't always sound so North American. I started as an actor. I went to New York for acting school. I taught myself IPA. I taught myself to try to sound more American so I could get the jobs I wanted to get. So that's constantly shifting. And of course, when I'm in contexts where I feel like I actually want to sound more accented, I start to play with putting that accent back on, as many people who speak various languages do that. Again, we code switch all the time, or code mesh. So that's kind of my starting point. Specifically, I have the privilege right now, I'm doing a postdoctoral research project, as Marjorie mentioned, and what that allows me to do is to work with smaller theater companies that are investigating using different fluencies in the theater. And I guess and I'll get to several examples in a second, but for me, what's interesting about entering a space where the different people who've come to play in that space have all agreed and have been invited on the basis of the fact that they might bring different things to the table is very important. What, of course, again, as was mentioned in the panel earlier today about directing across difference, what that difference is and that uniqueness and that distinction will vary. But again, specifically, I'm working in contexts where what people are bringing are, very basically either multiple fluencies, linguistic fluencies, as well as different cultural backgrounds. And again, oftentimes, those different cultural backgrounds all in the same person, right? So moving past also that assumption that you're one thing and the other person is one thing, right? So it's a lot of mix. And for me, what's really interesting when we come to play in that space and try to create new material, and I work in contexts that are collectively devised, so we're creating the context and the text, and I'll give you some examples. But the first thing for me is to be really attentive to the presumed standards of how to act within the space, which again was mentioned in the previous panel, speaking to schooling, speaking to access, because we oftentimes, in my experience, have a lot of suppositions around linguistic comprehension of actors and of the audience, our presumed audience, and not just Again, when I say languages, because I'm not only interested in verbal or spoken language, I also mean gestures. So, for example, what often happens is we might all bring our different verbal languages, but because, again, my training was in New York, so my gestural language of what it means to come into a space neutral, right? That culture, that body, how the body speaks in that space, and how we start to maybe invite other ways of that body to speak. Are questions for me, to be aware of those presumptions that were coming in, which oftentimes, again, are coming from within. It's not being dictated from the outside. We're all meeting, wanting to work with all of our fluencies, but often getting stuck in, well, we're going to work in a certain style, kind of what Guillermo Verdecchio was saying before, right? That reiteration of certain patterns of expectation, which limit the final product of where we're going. Specifically, very proximally, I just had the chance to be an auditor for the workshop that's part of this symposium. So there was a short workshop on subject creation. It's in the program if you want a little blurb, that was organized by Sohail and Modern Times Company. And the idea was to bring in actors and directors from, again, diverse backgrounds, and to get them to play with a couple of short scenes of Beckett. And I just want to briefly throw that in there, because what was really fascinating about that work for me was to see how, again, the actors were invited to play and use not necessarily the text in English, but the text in any languages they spoke, as well as gibberish, as well as different physical vocabularies. We had one director, Roshan, who threw in, he had them perform for a moment to try rehearsing in Italian opera style, and then to try doing it in Bollywood style. And again, this question of, we start subverting what are the expectations of the fluencies in which we're working, and what an actor can do. And for me, what's interesting in those moments is to see how, when actors, again, speaking to training and the rehearsal space, when actors are invited to keep playing with that, there are moments of short-circuiting, of course, and any actor in the room knows that, you get all these kind of semi-contradictory directions, or any multilingual knows that when they're switching in their head, there's those moments of, oh, wait, what, how, right? But those fantastic little moments of short circuit, but also the tension that creates, and what that, for me, the playfulness of what it allows to rethink of a form. So for me, that was a really interesting rehearsal process. It was just a workshop, but again, for me as a dramaturg who's working, and I'll get to the second production I'm working on in a second, but to start thinking about it not only as a different way of rehearsing in the space, because I think that enriches it already, and then you could just do the Beckett in English, but with all those layers of rehearsal internalized, right? But you could also bring some of that interesting layering of the rehearsal process into the final production. And what would that do, and how would it challenge and invite an audience to be navigating that with you? And again, not forgetting that gibberish is a language, and the different languages of gibberish, and how we play with comprehension and inability to understand on stage, which I think oftentimes when we start talking about language and accents, we kind of forget, again, as has been mentioned, the possibility of what potentially the theater space can be. It's not supposed to be one-to-one, is it? That's my provocation. For me, it's far more interesting when it isn't, and it forces me to think in a way I wasn't anticipating. And it forces me to realize what I do understand and what I don't understand. A second project I'm working on is called In Sundry Languages, and it's a show that is collectively devised by the Toronto Laboratory Theatre, and it will be at the Toronto Fringe this summer. So we're very excited because we get the couple of months ahead to workshop it. And the idea behind the show is that it is a show that is plurilingual. It's in multiple languages. The performers performing in it are coming, again, from either different cultures or intercultural, but everybody it either speaks more than one language or is willing to play in more than one language, which is also an interesting distinction, to have monolingual actors willing to try on different languages, as well as multilingual actors being asked to perform in languages they don't speak. Like, I speak 5 languages, but I don't speak all of them, right? So how do we push that challenge? And the idea there is we're not using any translation, actually. So English is still the lingua franca in the rehearsal room. English is still very prevalent, I think, at least we're going to try to decenter English. But the point is that there will be moments, there will be lots of content in which the audience is not hearing English, which again, for many multilinguals, for many immigrants, that's a very common experience. And we're interested in playing with what those tensions evoke, and not only to use it as is very often used artistically in North American theater, to use a foreign language as an alienation technique, right? So how do we start to play, but also realizing that perhaps the first time someone goes into Mandarin, for some of the audience, that's an alienation technique. Oh, who are they? I thought they sounded Canadian. What just happened, right? But then what else can happen, and how can we play with that? Specifically, and in kind of wrapping, for me, and this is maybe where the stakes kind of shift, is I'm very invested in the socio-political possibilities of the theater. So for me, I'm very interested in actors that are coming together not only to bring these multiple fluencies, but also to trouble and to upset the representational expectations of what those things mean. And again, oftentimes, as was mentioned in the panel prior, such conflict comes up in rehearsal, right? Those different positions. And I'm interested in also seeing those on stage. So if you were here before in the panel before, I asked a question and I mentioned Yael Ronen and her ensemble, and they work in Berlin out of the Maxim Gorky Theater. And if you don't know about them, I really urge you to check them out as an example of an ensemble that's intercultural, cross-cultural, and working in multiple languages, and putting that linguistic conflict and that cultural conflict on stage and politicizing that. But for me, with that, I'm personally very weary of kind of imposing a colorblind casting, whether that be when we're talking about visible or audible or casting. And the reason is because I think, for me, it's not to say to exclude, but for where I'm standing and working in the independent theater scene, not the mainstream is very, very different and kind of in a different temporality. But in the independent theater scene, I think we're past, hopefully, that space of just excluding people for being distinct. But I think it's important for me to honor and recognize what are the specificities that different performers are bringing in, which again ties into questions of let them tell their stories, not another iteration of Shakespeare, right? Or how do we, again, bring that in and trouble that, as opposed to saying, which again is just another way of working. It's just my personal aesthetic and political preference. I'm not interested in going to see a show where just everybody looks different, but we're supposed to be like, yeah, whatever. I'm interested in, oh, cool, so what did you bring into the rehearsal? And again, oftentimes because we're meeting here, wherever here is, we may have all received very similar training, so we're bringing in very similar aesthetics and tendency towards style. But for me, it's very interesting to start to think about how can we shift that, and how can we push against that. So then what we're working is in the difference. And again, not just verbal, but also what the bodies are doing, which I think, again, oftentimes the gestural vocabulary is really overlooked. So just a second, sorry. Just to play. Oh, so again, yeah, kind of, I guess just to sum up, for me, the idea is, again, to try to work in these rehearsal spaces where we're trying to push and prod and see where we can go. Obviously, that means that all the actors who are joining or all the participants are already keen on that as a common ground, right? We have as a common ground the desire to play. But that idea of kind of breaking against that kind of acting tradition of leave yourself at the door and come in, right? And again, that question which Cynthia brought up, and for sure, actors can be anyone, but when we're working in a collective creation setting, I think one of the things as we're creating material together is to really try to give space to what are the specific things we're bringing, because those are distinct, and have those voices heard, and also, hear those voices in conflict on stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Question from the audience, up on the aisle here.
Thank you for a very interesting panel. I've been sitting very patiently here trying to ask the question. It's a question to the Shelley, but actually to every speaker, because I think what the common thread is here is the difference between the use of language as something psychophysical, something biological almost, something that we it's part of who we are in terms of how we perceive, how we communicate with the world, and so on. The same as our gestures, the same as our bodies, the same as our faces, physique, and so on. And the language as a professional tool of expression. And in one case, it may be stand-up comedy when we need to work on a certain intonation, certain variation, certain rhythmical structure of the phrase to actually make the joke work. I'll be talking about it tomorrow with regards to Russian author Nikolai Gogol. And in the other case, it's just the dramaturgy of those conflicts, right? You know, and I guess what you were talking about, Shelley, at the very end, you know, is that we kind of tend to forget, you know, that theater is multi-plural form, and the language and sound is just one of them, right? You know, so, and it seems to be, to me, maybe I'm wrong, you know, is that basically working in the multilingual, multicultural kind of, you know, setup, what we need to do is to go to the basics of theater, right? You know, and to maybe verify what the objectives are, what the intentions are, what the function of the characters are. So we're kind of going to the basics of theatrical action. And in this case, perhaps, you know, language is just one of the tools and so on. So what this is partly comment, partly question, you know, but I'm really curious in this, about this difference between language as a sort of psychophysical, natural sort of form of, you know, identification, you know, and making us who we are, and the professional tool. Okay, thank you.
Shelley, do you want to address that first? Oh, she just needs.
Yeah, Yana, thank you for your question. I guess I really appreciate that distinction, again, between language as something psychophysical and as a tool, right? And again, the question that, like, in similar, those distinctions when we're talking about language, like what Julia was saying about the difference between language and accent, right? And that question of work. And I guess what I just want to throw in there, and again, working as a dramaturg, and maybe I think a bit we're talking about this and all, you know, relaying kind of our optimal conditions or our optimal view of theater, but important to remember that there are so many different aesthetics in the theater and so many different forms of working. And for me, that question kind of really hinges on what's the aesthetic that you're trying to create, right? And how does that work? Because again, even though the mainstream, you know, in Toronto might be more used to a certain form of, you know, realism, but you know, there are many other forms of working, and those dislocate and question those questions. Like even if you look at Richard Maxwell, right, and his players and how they're playing with everything is supposed to look like psychological realism, but that doesn't mean that those actors are not trained actors. So those spaces are really potentially porous. Which again, for me, again, because I'm kind of a huge theater nerd, I love the meshing, and I'm really curious about those distinctions. And again, as was brought up before, I think, and I'll let my panelists, my fellow panelists, respond to you as well. But for me, it's also really a question of where do we want to go with this? And again, what is the skill set of the people in the room, right? Because different performers will have access to different ways of working and wanting to work in relation to those two things. In my experience, it's very distinct depending on, you know, again, aesthetic tendency.
Can I, oh yes, go ahead, Julia.
No.
I'd love to hear what Samreen has to say on this subject, particularly the way ASL is situated at the center of deaf culture, or deaf culture in North America. I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Certainly, I could speak to that. ASL is something that, as a culturally deaf person, I mean, you've embodied that from the time you've come into the world and acquired the language. There's facial grammar, there's visual grammar, there's time and tense markers that are shown on the face. I mean, that's something that is embedded in you. It's the same as when somebody who speaks English. We have a different structure in terms of subject, verb, and object. And now when you look at theater, if you're talking about classical theater like Shakespeare, you need to have the overall, what's the arching theme of the story, what's happening? What is happening on the stage? How are you doing blocking? What's going on with that? What's the tone at that piece in the script? What's the story that's being told? You need to take that, you're working with a script and it has to be translated as well. So again, we're not talking about English. We're talking about if you're representing all of those pieces I just spoke to. And believe me, the translation process is a complicated process. But it's about embodying that ASL on stage for the specific purposes of that specific production and what's being played out. So again, just like you can imagine with any languages, when you take an English phrase, don't think that that automatically translates over into American Sign Language. There's not necessarily always an equivalent because you need to keep in mind different cultural experiences. So you need to figure out, okay, if this doesn't translate directly, what would be something that would be a near or culturally matching equivalent, if you will.
So just to offer that in this scenario with a performer with ASL as their first language, that it may not be possible to separate that out. Is that I just that's how I feel like that it may not be possible. It's so embedded in as a visual language, as a physical language, that is part of the makeup of that particular performer. Just to offer. I know Cynthia is eager.
Yes, I would say that that's true.
Yeah, I mean, relatively. You know, I just wanted to mention that really the companies that we looked up to, at least in growing up in Europe, there were Peter Brook's company that was international, Ariane Mnuchin company that was international, Jiří Grotowski's company that was international, Eugenio Barba's company that was international. Those were the ones that we looked up to. Those were the ones, and now we have Modern Stage Company here. That is actually an international troupe. The makeup of the company is international, and so you know, to speak to that, yeah, going back to. Is this obviously we're going back again to Jonathan Miller, who says what is vital to you, and if it is vital to you to go back to I guess all the elements of the theater, and we've talked here about repertoire, and I think even in taking Shakespeare in your repertoire, you could do what you said that you were doing with many languages. I mean. Because to you something else is vital, and then we're talking about the language, and then we're talking about the style. I think we've been talking about all of those three things. So, but I just wanted to mention earlier on we were talking about can you lose your accent, and I am eager to respond to that. From what I understand, and David Smuckler told me that many years ago. I think he's told me that that. By the age of 12, that the tongue muscles are fully formed. And so it just depends on what accent you want to. I mean, I didn't sound like this 30 years ago when I came to Canada. I sounded very differently in intonations and all of that. I picked up, I learned, I tried my best. This is the best I can do for now. Maybe I can do a little better later. Thank you. But I really tried hard. But there is a limit. I can sound but like the 90% that guy who worked really hard. So, you know, by the age of 12, it's not like I don't want to. It's just I can't. Because by the age of 12, my tongue was fully formed, apparently. And I could those muscles just won't, you know, form. So, you can't. You can't lose your accent, Diana.
We have about 10 minutes, so we can entertain some other questions. Yes, I'm just going to start. This woman had her hand up. Right at the back there.
No?
Okay.
Oh God. This is terrifying. Okay. I don't know if we're doing names still, but hi, I'm Naomi. Hi. And I was just going to talk about kind of like technology integrating in theater. And I just think that that's coming so to the forefront of theater of how much we integrate technology now. And I was just going to touch on whether you think, looking at the title Beyond Accents, if maybe we wanted to start thinking about integrating subtitles into theater and projecting that. And rather than people learning an accent for English, so learning a like German English accent, rather than looking at that, how can we go further than that and maybe look at people's accents but speaking German and, you know, speaking the language that is their native tongue. kind of Inglorious Bastard style. And maybe if you guys want to talk about that.
I might just say a little bit, and I'll let Shelley chime in. Cahoots did, with Theatre Passe Muraille, did do a production with deaf artists, deaf actors on stage, and we did have it titled, our dynamic titling again, by designer Trevor Schwellnus. And kind of the amazing thing is that was access for a lot of people, a part of our audience, including people where English was not their first language. For example, my parents. My parents, came from Hong Kong. They're fluent in English, and yet they came to see the show, and they really appreciated the surtitles, the dynamic titling that was available. And so it was I found that quite fascinating that the titling can, in fact, be useful for a lot of different people, and even just to establish a point. I'm going to let Shelley speak to this as well.
Actually, if I could just jump in too, I would love to hear from Shamreen and Peter here, because their production of Cast 9 worked dynamic surtitling into the scenographic space in a really remarkable way that I think allows us to entertain the idea of what new theatrical forms are possible when we integrate surtitling and allow it to shape the scenographic environment. If Shamreen
So maybe Peter can speak to that.
You comment first, Samreen.
Okay. I'll keep it short, and then you get to do all the details. How's that?
Okay.
Fair? I'm not going to talk all about all of it, and I'm not going to take over. So, I think it was a really unique use of technology. So, when I would sign, there were some pieces where we used the dynamic surtitling. And then there were other parts in the scene, we would actually have an interpreter doing the voiceover to the piece that I signed. So they were behind the scenes, and you wouldn't even see the interpreter, but it would be interpreted. So we used a variety of techniques. So it wasn't that it was just, it kept it very dynamic and very lively. It was quite a different way to do it, and I thought it worked beautifully, actually. So did I get that right, Peter?
Yeah, that's pretty good. There was our goal was to make it accessible for a hearing and a deaf audience, like equally accessible. But that didn't mean that we wanted every moment to be understandable by everyone. There was moments when either the deaf audience or the hearing audience could not necessarily understand everything that was being said on stage. So everyone was in this position of trying to reach across this language divide to try to understand what was being said. So there was moments when there was such a bombard of subtitles that you couldn't possibly follow everything that's being said, and at the same time the actors were talking over the top of each other, so you could only pick up a certain amount of the words. So we created a certain amount of linguistic confusion in those moments, which was part of, represented the gap between the two cultures that we were exploring. But one of the interesting things with surtitles is that I really enjoyed having watching the deaf actors, Samreen and Kat, performing and be able to hear what they were saying, so I could watch their gestures and, as a hearing person, understand what they were saying. And I felt it was harder to go the other way around. It was harder to watch the hearing actors and then for somebody else following the sign language. We put the ASL interpreter on stage with the actors rather than having them to the side, in the hope that you could comprehend the visual picture at the same time as you were reading the signs. But that was much more difficult to pull off, and that's something I'd like to go back to and try again, because it wasn't fully integrated, and the two languages were sitting next to each other, but you had to choose between them in a way that the hearing audience members didn't have to choose. They could watch the signs and hear the words at the same time. But trying to figure that out was so fascinating, and then mixing it in with the subtitles and everything was really part of the joy of the process for me.
Great. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to add something to that. In terms of being a deaf person, part of everyday life is to not have subtitles present when we're out and about, right? Even going to movie theater, there's no subtitles or surtitles at any time for that. So for, hearing people to have that experience that we experience every day, was, I think, a really interesting part of that process for them to understand what we go through on a daily basis and help them understand, what it is that perhaps, we experience as a deaf individual. I know it was challenging for them, but I think it was a good experience also for the audience to go through that and to have some gaps in the information that was provided. And so I think that, it was a beneficial experience for everyone.
Thank you. We don't have very long, but I just want to make sure that Shelley just respond to that. We're at time, so we'll just take one more question then. Apologies.
So I'm actually stealing a term from Yana, who was like whispering cool things into my ear. So the elephant in the room is authenticity and Canadian realism, and not accents. And the reason we can't get jobs because, we have accents or don't have accents, whatever, is because there's an expectation that a certain face should have a certain accent, a certain character should have a certain accent. And some of us encounter this on a regular basis. When I have a longer beard, there's an expectation of an accent. When I shave, there is no expectation of an accent. There's research on that says people actually have certain perception of accents and faces, and it's often racist. My question is, why aren't we talking, we're only talking about actors constantly. But accent is not only in my mouth, it's also in your ears. It's the way you hear me or anybody else here in this room. So what about the audiences? Who forms the perception of those people, and why the hell do they expect realism and authenticity all the time?
I don't know, that requires a response other than applause. We are at time, so I just want to... So we're allowed to push a little bit, except we require a break as well in the interpretation, and so if we're not going to have a full conversation, I think we can continue that and break apart to have that conversation, but we're not able to okay. I want to thank each of the panelists. Thank you so much for your time and your positioning and your grace. Thank you to everyone here. As I said, we will continue to be around, and so that conversation can happen, but in smaller pockets. Thank you all for your attention and your patience and your questions. Thank you.
And thank you, Marjorie, for chairing it. We did actually manage to cover all of those topics you listed at the beginning. It's absolutely amazing. And I think some really interesting things. I think that panel and the ongoing discussion should be called something like Language Beyond Problem to Opportunity, something like that, so we can get those spaces Peter mentioned between, and Shelley mentioned as well, the what was the word you used? The little moments of short circuit as opportunities. I think that's a great beginning of a much longer conversation. So thank you.